You've probably heard about the word cinematography already. It's a visual art. In a film project, there's also a cinematographer, and their role is to make creative decisions to both camera and light. In smaller projects, they could be the camera guy as well, but most often they don't touch the camera. The camera operator does that and listens to what the cinematographer asks them to do. So far in this class, we've been learning about the basics of filmmaking. Right now, you have a technical bag of knowledge, which makes you a great camera operator. You know how to set up the camera properly, make a nice academic framing of the subject. You understand when a cinematographer asks you to shoot handheld instead of on a tripod. You know how a tripod works and why you should or shouldn't use a gimbal. The role of the cinematographer goes beyond that. Visual storytelling through lighting, camera framing, and movement. Telling 1,000 words through one camera shot. And most importantly, create depth. Creating depth is where it all starts with. It's the next chapter in your filmmaking career, and I might make a new class about that. Until then, here's an introduction. What many people forget is that video is two-dimensional. It's flat. You could project a video onto a piece of paper. That's how flat video is. Now, don't get me wrong, we do capture a 3D world, but we look at it on a 2D screen. That's why it's so important to create depth, so that we can show the three-dimensional world onto the 2D plane. Now, one way of doing that is by simply adding camera movement, whether you go handheld, shoot on a gimbal, or on a slider. You're moving the camera through the scene, and thus we see a parallax. In other words, the audience gets a better understanding of the space that the camera sits in. Another way to create more depth is by having the foreground and background objects out of focus. So we open the aperture, the focus area gets smaller, and thus the background becomes more blurry. We could even place an object in the foreground to get the same results. We can look at this shot here in 3 layers now. The foreground objects, the subject, and the background. They are separated from each other. This creates depth. Framing is another tool to create more depth. Say that we have everything in focus and shoot from a tripod. The way that you frame your scene or subject can make it appear flat or show depth. And I do happen to have a whole entire class about cinematic camera framing, which I can highly recommend to check out. I'll leave a link here in the class notes as well as in the class description. Now, without going into details, we can use lighting and shadows to show the three-dimensional world much better. Colors and contrast. So many different ways of creating depth. Now, it's not necessary that you create depth through every possible way. You pick 1 or 2 techniques, just as long as you're actively looking for at least one way to create depth with every shot. And that kind of brings me to the end of the class. Now, I have one last conclusion lesson left, so don't leave just yet.